it goes back to Tumblr. Well, I think I followed this Taiwanese person who said, I don't use the label Chinese because it has too many ties to like political belonging, and like I'm not from the PRC, so I don't feel comfortable using this sort of like national term Chinese. So then I think they were the one who was like, oh, Sino, because as you say, like the word Sino exists as a root to describe Chineseness in other words. And so we kind of just took that the identifications of Chineseness are so different. And there are definitely a lot of people who wouldn't be comfortable, whether it's because they're from other parts of the Sinosphere or because they're diasporic, who wouldn't feel comfortable with such a nationally loaded term as Chinese. And then also, I just think that it makes me think of a hugely seminal essay that I read last year, which is called Fuck Chineseness by Alan Chun. And it's kind of about what Chineseness means, right? And he says, like, there are so many different forms of Chineseness that it's impossible. You can't define what is Chinese, right? Because if you say, like, here is how I'm defining Chineseness, there's always going to be exclusions and things that you haven't missed. In trying to define something, you're inherently going to be excluding other things. And in terms of community building, that's kind of hard to do. And so what he says that's really interesting, that I've thought about a lot ever since I read it, is what's interesting is not what is Chineseness, but rather how is Chineseness constructed and affirmed and also destabilized. And instead of asking what Chineseness does X, Y, or Z pertain to, it's more interesting to examine moments in which there is a crisis of identity, in which Chineseness comes into question. So he has like all of these really interesting ideas about what it means to define and to enact and to theorize Chineseness. I think that, these ideas of Chineseness, so even though you can't define Chineseness, at the same time, there's also stuff that you can point to and be like, oh, that's Chinese. So what does it mean? Like that definition and the ownership of words, as I was saying, is so in flux. And so obviously what's much more interesting is thinking about the ways in which it is in flux rather than the ways in which it is stable, because it is never stable. Mm-hmm. So Sino is kind of not necessarily a reclaiming. I mean, it's not a reclaiming of the word because it's not been really used before, but it's more like staking our claim on this like new identity. I don't want to say radical because I feel like it's too self-congratulatory, but just this new way of thinking about identity. And I think it's great that there's this word that kind of exists, but that hasn't really been put into usage. And it's starting to be used. Like I'm starting to see a lot of people being like Sino diaspora. And I think it's great because it means that we're really kind of, we're entering into this like new discourse of like the way that we talk about ourselves and the way that we talk about our community and belonging. And I think it's just like really powerful and interesting sort of to have accidentally used this new word in a way that has been originated spontaneously, that isn't dictated by any kind of sort of official state power, and that is inherently sort of about building small scale that snowballs into bigger scale. And I think that the casualness and the sort of vague position of the word Sino is really useful. It's a useful way for us to think about identity from here moving forward.